China's capitalist economy. For people who don't know, despite the Chinese and Xi Jinping government using communist rhetoric on Marxist Leninism, Mao Zedong for socialism, a Chinese characteristic for a new era, that's a mouthful. Well, despite praising Thomas Piketty's works as a great critique of capitalism and why we need socialism, his largest work ever, Capital Ideology, has been censored in China because it exposed the Chinese capitalist elements in their economy, showing that China is not socialist nor communist. While 2050 it claimed to become a socialist society, but later they changed that to 2078, and then eventually it's gonna be like never. Let's say they actually become 2078 socialists. I'll be 80 years old when that happens. I hope immortality becomes a thing because boy oh boy, I can't wait the shitstorm that's gonna happen with my eyes. Or robotic eyes, I don't know. So what is this censorship? What happened to his work capital ideology that China doesn't want you to know because it's capitalist? So instead of me trying to talk shit, what happened did not happen with the censorship, let me read from the book itself, Capital and Ideology by Thomas Piketty, which I think I consider one of the greatest economists of our time. And although he's a democratic socialist, not much of a revolutionary, I think his book is by far the best democratic socialist book ever. I think it should be the only one we should read when it comes to democratic socialism. I prefer Marxian and anarchist, other revolutionary literature, but still, like if you're new to socialism, you want to go soft, don't go very hardcore, then I think capital ideology is the way to go. So, what did he say that was censored in China? Let me read from the man himself from the book. On China as an authoritarian mixed economy. We turn now to communism and post-communism in China. It is well known that China drew lessons from the USSR's failures as well from its own mistakes in the Maoist era, 1949 to 1976, during which the intent to completely abolish private property and to initiate a forced march toward collectivization and industrialization ended in disaster. In 1978, the country began experimenting with a novel type of political economic regime, which rests on two pillars: a leading role for the Chinese Communist Party (CCP), which has been maintained and even reinforced in recent years, and the development of a mixed economy, based on a novel balance between private and private property, which has proven to be durable. Which begin with the second pillar, which is essential for understanding the specificities of the Chinese case. Another advantage of this choice is that the contrast with the Western experience is illuminating. The best way to proceed is to pull together data from all available sources concerning the ownership of firms, farmland, residential real estate, and financial assets and liabilities of all kinds in order to estimate the share of property owned by the government at all levels. The results show in a figure which compares China evolution to that of the leading capitalist countries, United States, Japan, Germany, United Kingdom, and France, which eventually it was censored in China because it exposed the wealth gap in China and the increase of inequality. The fall of public property from 1978 to 2018 interpretation. The share of public capital, public access, net of debt include all public access, firms, buildings, land investment, and financial assets, and national capital, total public and private, was roughly 70% in China in 1978, and then stabilized around 30% in the mid 2000s. It was at 15 to 30% in the capitalist countries in the 1970s. It was near zero or negative in the late 2010s. The main conclusion is that public share of capital was close to 70% in China in 1978, when economic reforms were inaugurated, but then fell sharply in the 1980s and 1990s before stabilizing around 30% since the mid 2000s. In other words, the gradual privatization of Chinese property ended in 2005-2006. The relative shares of public and private property have barely moved since then. Because the Chinese economy has continued to grow at a rapid rate, private capital has obviously continued to increase. New land have been improved and new factories have apartment buildings to have continued to build at a breakneck pace, but publicly owned capital has also continued to increase at roughly the same rate as privately owned capital. China does appear to have settled on a mixed economy property structure. The country is no longer communist since nearly 70% of all property is now private. But it's not completely capitalist either because public property still account for a little more than 30% of the total, a minority share but still substantial. Because of the Chinese government led by the CCP owns a third of all there is to own in the country. Its scope for economic intervention is large. It can decide where to invest, create jobs, and launch regional development programs. It is important to note that 30% public share of capital is an average that hides every large differences between sectors and access categories. For instance, residential real estate is almost entirely privatized. In the late 2010s, the government and firms own less than 5% of the housing stock, which has become the leading private investment of Chinese households with sufficient means. This has caused the price of real estate to skyrocket, especially since other savings opportunities are limited and the public retirement system is underfunded and shaky. By contrast, the government held 55 to 60% of the total capital of firms in 2010, including both listed and unlisted firms of all sizes and all sectors. This share has remained virtually unchanged since 2005 to 2006. In other words, the state and party continue to maintain tight control over the productive system, indeed tighter than ever with respect to the largest firms. Since the mid 2000s, there has been a significant decrease in the share of firm capital held by foreign investors, which have been offset by the increase in the share held by Chinese households. From the 1950s to the 1970s, the capitalist country will also mix economies, with important variation from country to country. Public assets took many firms, including infrastructure, public buildings, schools, and hospitals. In addition, many firms were publicly owned. There was a public financial participation in certain sectors. Furthermore, public debt was historically low owing to post-war inflation and government measures to reduce debt, such as exceptional taxes on private capital or even outright debt cancellation. All told, the share of public capital net on debt in national capital was generally 23% in the capitalist countries in the period 1950 to 1980. In the late 1970s, available estimates show that a level of 25 to 30% in Germany and the United Kingdom, 15 to 20% in France, and the United States and Japan. To be sure, these levels are lower than the share of public capital in China today, but not by much. Ownership of the Chinese firms 1978 to 2018. The Chinese state, at all levels of government in 2017 held roughly 55% of the capital of Chinese firms, both listed and unlisted of all sizes and sectors, compared with 33% for Chinese households and 12% for foreign investors. The share of the latter has been decreased since 2006, and that of the Chinese households has increased, while the share of the Chinese state has stabilized at around 55%. The difference is that Western countries had long since ceased to be mixed economies owing to privatization of public access, for instance, the utilities and telecommunications sectors. Limited investment in sectors that remain public, especially education and health, and the steady increase of public indebtedness, the share of net public capital in national capital has shrunk to virtually zero, less than 5%. In all major capitalist countries, the United States and the United Kingdom, it is negative. In other words, in the latter two countries, public debts exceed the total value of public access. This is a striking fact, and I will say more later about its significance and implication. At this stage, note simply how rapid the change has been when I published Capital in the 21st Century, which by the way Xi Jinping had promoted as a great book but censored this book in 2013 and 2014. The latest available complete dataset pertain the years 2010 to 2011. Among the development countries, only Italy had public debt that exceeds public capital. 6 years later, 2019, with data available from 2016 to 2017, the United States and United Kingdom have also entered the realm of negative public wealth. By contrast, China appeared to have settled on a permanent mixed economy. Of course, it is impossible to predict how things will evolve in the long run. Sorry. The Chinese case is in many ways unique. The country is in a throes of debate about further privatization, and it's difficult to predict what the outcome will be. For the foreseeable future, the current equilibrium will most likely continue, especially since the demand for change is coming from opposing ideological camps and taking contradictory forms. A number of social democratic intellectuals are demanding new forms of power sharing decentralization with an important role for worker representatives and independent trade unions, which currently do not exist, and diminished role for the party officials at both the state and local level. By contrast, business circles are demanding further privatization and reinforcements of the role of private shareholders and market mechanisms, with an eye to moving China closer to a capitalist model of the Anglo-American type. Meanwhile, the CCP leaders feel they had good reason to oppose both sides, whose proposals they fear might threaten the country's harmonious and balanced growth in the long run, as well as reduce their own role. Before going further, several points deserve to be highlighted. In general, it is important to keep in mind that the very definition of public and private property are not set in stone. They depend on specific features of each legal, economic, and political system. The temporal evolution and international comparisons show indicate rough orders of magnitude, but the prediction of the data should not be overestimated. For example, Chinese farmlands was partly private before the 1978 reforms, in the sense that it could be passed on from peasant to children, along with improvements to the land, provided the children remain officially rural residents. China has a system of residential registration and mobility control under which every Chinese citizen holds an official resident permit. The Q would designate the holder as a rural or urban resident. A rural resident can work in the city and retain ownership of farmland, but only if the migration is temporary. If the person wishes to move permanently to the city and satisfies the requirement, primarily years of residence, he may ask for his rural yuku to be converted into an urban one, which is often necessary for spouses and children to have access to school and public services such as healthcare. However, he must then forfeit ownership of any village land, including any capital gain on the land, which can be considerable because of rising land prices. We explain why some urban migrants prefer to hold on their rural yuku. If the land is forfeit, it reverts to a local government, which can reassign to it other individuals who hold a rural hukou for that particular village. Such a land is therefore a form of property somewhere between private and public. The exact rules of governing its ownership have evolved over time, and we have tried to take this into account in our estimates, but the results are inevitably approximated. Note, finally, the striking contrast between China's trajectory and trajectories of the Western countries in the first decade of the 20th century, when the share of public capital in total national capital has remained stable at around 30% in China since 2006. The financial crisis of 2007-2008, which was caused by excessive deregulation of private finance and contributed to further private enrichment, had reduced public wealth in the West even more. The point is, of course, not to idealize public property in China, much less to pretend to how the ideal share of public capital in a just society. Once the state assumes responsibility for producing certain goods and services, such as education and healthcare, it stands to reason that it will hold a share of productive capital correlate with its share of total employment, say 20%. This is an adequate rule of thumb, however, because it ignores the state's potential role in using debt to channel savings toward the preservation of natural capital and the accumulation of non-physical capital. The real question had to do with firms and governments and power sharing associated with public and private property, which must be continually questioned, reevaluated, and reinvented. In the Chinese case, the mode of governance of public property is notable for its vertical authoritarian character and can hardly be taken as a universal model. On the limits of the Chinese tolerance of inequality. Back to inequality in China. How has the income distribution changed at the beginning of the process of economic liberalization and privatization of property in 1978? The available sources indicate a very sharp increase of income inequality from time the reforms began until the mid 2000s, when the situation stabilized in the late 2010s. China, to judge by the share of national income going to the top 10% at the bottom 50%, is only slightly less egalitarian than the United States and significantly more so than Europe, where it has the most egalitarian of the three regions at the beginning of the 1980s. If we compare China to other Asian giants, India is clear that since the early 1980s, China has been both more efficient in terms of growth and more egalitarian in terms of income distribution or rather less egalitarian in the sense of concentration of income, has increased less dramatically than in India. As noted earlier in the discussion of India, one reason for this difference is that China has been able to invest more in public infrastructure, education, and healthcare. China achieved a much higher level of tax revenue than India, where basic healthcare education services remain notoriously underfinanced. Indeed, in 2010, China has nearly matched Western levels of taxation, taking roughly 30% of national income in taxes and roughly 40% if one includes profit from public firms and sale of public lands. The Chinese success is well known and they lead many people to conclude that the regime will go unchallenged as long as it continues to achieve this level of economic success and can continue to rely on the fact that many Chinese fear that the country will split apart if not ruled with a firm hand. But there may be limits to the Chinese people's tolerance of inequality. First, the fact that China so quickly became so much more inegalitarian than Europe was by no means inevitable or clearly represented a failure for the regime. In the 1980s, the level of income inequality was close to that of the most egalitarian countries in Europe, such as Sweden. The same is true of wealth inequality, which show, by the way, how egalitarian the privatization process was. The top decile share of total private share was 40 to 50% of the early 1990s. Below that of Sweden and other European countries in the 2010s, it is close to 70%, a level close to that of the United States and only slightly lower than Russia. Inequality in China, Europe, and United States 1980 to 2018. Income inequality increased sharply in China between 1980 and 2018, but is still below that of the United States, though higher than Europe, according to available sources. Now, to go from Sweden to American levels of inequality in the space of a few decades is not an insignificant change for a country like China, which officially continued to promote socialism with Chinese characteristics. For some Chinese businessmen who long felt that such slogan had no real social or economic significance, this hardly mattered because they find the Anglo-American model of capitalism so attractive. But for social democrat intellectuals and much of the population, this extremely rapid rise of inequality is a problem, especially since no one knows where it will end, given that Europe has demonstrated the possibility of achieving prosperity while eliminating inequality. It is not clear why Chinese socialism should tolerate levels of inequality on a par with American capitalism. The situation raised questions about the way privatization was conducted, about the redistributive policy in China, and more generally about the orientation of the reform process. The existence of an internal passport and migration restrictions in China, especially between rural and urban zones when free circulation of labor has become the norm in Europe, may also help to explain China's high level of inequality. More especially, economic reforms had primarily benefited urban centers, while rural areas had not reaped the gains they had hoped for. The modification of the system over the decades had not proved sufficient to reduce the differences between urban and rural areas. Mobility restrictions are not the only reason for this, because similar inequality exists within urban zones and to a lesser extent within rural zones. Furthermore, despite using a few restrictions, the system remains quite authoritarian and in recent years has been augmented by a potential far more intrusive system of social control, including the awarding of social grades and social credit based on massive data collection through social networks. Recent research shows that the less advantaged social groups are less tolerant of these procedures, whose repressive aspects in connection with other social control policy also deserve to be emphasized. On the opposite of inequality in China, the stabilization of Chinese inequality since the mid 2000s might suggest that the worst of the increase is over. Bear in mind, however, that Chinese income and wealth data are extremely opaque. The estimates show they are the most in the figures are in the most reliable we could establish on the basis of current available Chinese sources. But the sources are flawed and full of holes. So it's quite possible that we are underestimating both the level and evolution of Chinese inequality. In theory, China has a progressive tax system. It was established in 1980, shortly after the beginning of the economic reforms, and its marginal rates range from 5% on the lowest bracket to 45% on the highest. A rate has not changed since 1980. Compared with the 13% flat tax in the post-Soviet Russia, with Chinese system therefore much more progressive, at least in theory. The problem is that no detailed data about the Chinese income tax has ever been published. The only information regularly made public is the figure for total revenue. It is impossible to know how many taxpayers pay the tax each year, how many are in each tax bracket, or by how much the number of high-income taxpayers are increased in particular city or province. The answer to such questions could help us to understand how the gains of Chinese growth have been distributed over the years. They might also help to realize that tax laws are not always being applied as rigorously at the local level as they are supposed to be. In 2006, the Chinese Fiscal Authority published a bulletin requiring all taxpayers with the income above 120,000 yuan, less than 1% of the adult population at the time, to fill out a special declaration, which was to be used in the fight against corruption. The result of this national survey was published in 2006 to 2011, but the rudimentary form, only the total number of taxpayers above the threshold was indicated, sometimes together with their aggregate income, without any further background. Publication was ended in 2011. It has been possible to find similar data publication by regional tax authorities, in some cases with different thresholds such as 500,000 yuan or 1 million yuan, in certain provinces between 2011 and 2017, but the information is irregular and inconsistent. Such is the fragmentary nature of the data we have used. Though sadly incomplete, the data have allowed us to revise substantial upward official Chinese measures of inequality as its evolution measure based solely on household declarations, which include a very few houses at this level of income. The estimate obtained can be compared with those for Europe and the United States, which are based on much more detailed data, including tax records, in a more plausible and satisfactory way than could be done before. Still, the Chinese estimate obviously remains quite fragile and may underestimate both the level and evolution of inequality in China. The fact that the authorities stopped publishing national data on high-income taxpayers in 2011 is especially worrisome. In some ways, public information about the workings of the income tax system is even scarce in China than in Russia, which is setting the bar quite low. Although lack of transparency about inequality is a global problem, about which I will say more in chapter 13. It is clear that Russia and China are more opaque than most. As for the recording and measurement of wealth in China, the situation is even worse than for income. In particular, there is no Chinese inheritance tax and therefore no data of any kind concerning inheritance, which greatly complicates the study of wealth concentration. It is truly paradoxical that a country led by Communist Party, which could play into adherence to socialism the Chinese characteristic, could make such a choice. As long as the extent of private wealth remained limited, the absence of inheritance tax was not very surprising. But now that two-thirds of the Chinese capital is in private hands, it is surprising that those who have benefited most from privatization and economic liberalization are allowed to pass all of their wealth onto their children without any tax, even a minimal one. Recall that after much variation over the course of the 20th century, the tax rate applied to the larger estates settled between 30 and 55% in the leading capitalist countries: the United States, United Kingdom, Japan, Germany, and France. In the period of 2000 to 2020 in Japan, at the top rate was even raised from 50 to 55% in 2015. In other capitalist countries of East Asia, there are high inheritance tax. For example, South Korea, the top rate is above 50%. So, we find ourselves in the early 21st century in a highly paradoxical situation. An Asian billionaire who would like to pass off his own fortune without paying any inheritance tax should move to communist China. A case that speaks volume is that of Hong Kong, which have a high inheritance tax when it was a British colony, but abolished it in 2005, shortly after it was handed back to the People's Republic of China in 1997. In Taiwan, many businessmen favor integrating the country into the People's Republic to do away with the inheritance tax. This tax competition in East Asia, partly driven by China, tends to reinforce the global trend while contributing to rising inequality in the region. The Hong Kong case illustrates a novel and particularly interesting trajectory. In the first place, it is the sole case of a capitalist country that became more egalitarian by joining a communist regime. Second, Hong Kong's position as a financial center played a key role in the development of China, in particular, it enabled wealthy Chinese to move capital outside their country more easily than they could have done through banking system of the People's Republic of China. It also allows large Chinese firms and Chinese government itself to invest abroad and conduct foreign transactions more nimbly than they could have done otherwise. To date, there is no evidence to suggest that capital flight from China was anywhere near as massive as it was observed in the Russian case, but given the extent of corruption in China, the tenuous nature of many of the property rights acquired through privatization, and the fact that rapid growth of recent decades may not continue, capital flight may increase in the future and undermine the regime from within. China, between communism and plutocracy. The political system imposed on Hong Kong also illustrates the ambiguities of the Chinese regime. Theoretically inspired by communists, but in practice sometimes closer to a certain type of plutocracy like the United States. Until 1997, the governor of Hong Kong was appointed by the Queen of England. The colony was governed by a complex system of assembly elected by indirect suffrages. In practice, it was governed by committees dominated by economic elites. It was not an explicitly censitary system like those found in the United Kingdom and France in the 19th century or until 1911 in Sweden, where a number of ballots and person who cast was proportional to the person's wealth, but the effect was similar. Power was essentially vested in the business elite. The proprietarian colonialist system was only slightly modified when Hong Kong was handed over to Communist China. Today, Hong Kong holds normally free elections, but candidates must first be approved by a nominating committee appointed by the authorities in Beijing and in practice controlled by Hong Kong business elites and other pro-Chinese oligarchs. In the abstract, one can imagine a world in which China would join with Europe, the United States, and other countries to establish a more transparent financial system that could put an end to all tax havens when located in Hong Kong, Switzerland, or the Cayman Islands. This may someday come to pass. Broad segments of the Chinese population are scandalized by the country's plutocratic turn. Some intellectuals have proposed a social democratic measure in the direct contradiction with the policy preferred by the regime, while others have worked a new way to combat inequality such as repression of the Tiananmen Square demonstration in 1989. At the moment, however, it is clear that we are still in a long way to seeing such a change in China. When the question about these issues, Chinese officials and intellectuals close to the government often explain that the authorities are aware of the risks of capital flight such as occurring in Russia and that China will soon develop new forms of progressive income, inheritance, and wealth tax. These predictions have yet to be borne out. However, a second response, no doubt more revealing, is that China has no need of such Western-style fiscal solutions, which are complex and often ineffective. It will need to invent its own remedies like the merciless battle that the CCP and the state authority have waged against corruption. Indeed, Xi Jinping, whose name was added in 2018 to preamble the Chinese constitution alongside Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, has written abundantly about socialism with Chinese characteristics, and nowhere in this theoretical text does one find any reference to progressive taxes, systems of co-management or self-management or power sharing within firms. By contrast, one finds many assertions of the effect that the invisible hand of the market needs to be firmly counterbalanced by the visible hand of the government, which must detect and correct every abuse. Xi Jinping frequently alluded to the danger of the potential degeneration of the party owing to the duration of its exercise of its power, which only an implacable struggle against corruption can prevent. The prospect of new Silk Roads is discussed in length, allowing Xi to discreetly put insistently develop the idea of the Chinese-led globalization, which will establish benevolent commercial ties between different parts of the world without political interference. This will at last put an end to Europe's mad colonial ambition and the damaging unequal treaties imposed on China and other countries. Geopolitically, a Eurasia power bloc with China as its center will ultimately relegate America to its proper place on the world periphery. When it comes to concentrating institutions for regulating inequality, ending injustices, and controlling corruption, however, it is clear that socialism with Chinese characteristics means nothing very specific. We are told that the visible hand of the government and the party must be implacable, but it is difficult to find out exactly what this means. It's not clear that imprisoning oligarchs or state officials who had too much conspicuously and scantily enriched themselves is enough to meet the challenge. In the fall of 2018, film star Van Blinking was arrested after a Star television news anchor revealed that she had a secret contract under which she was paid 50 million yuan, where her official pay was only 10 million yuan. The affair attracted a great deal of attention, and the government saw an ideal opportunity to show that it was prepared to take on the Sicily inequality of the call of money. This case is certainly interesting, but there is a good reason to doubt that inequality in a country of 1.3 billion people can be controlled simply by means of public denunciation and imprisonment without any systematic registration and taxation of wealth and estate, while journalists, citizens, and trade unions are prevented from developing the means to investigate abuses, and the police arrest anyone who showed too much interest in wealth accumulation by people with close ties with the government, nothing guaranteeing that the Chinese regime will able to avoid a kleptocratic fate similar to Russia's. On the effects of the Cultural Revolution and the perception of inequality. All they consider, the Chinese government apparently does not take very seriously the fact that a society based on private property without sufficient fiscal and social safeguard risks attaining a level of inequality that may prove harmful in the long run. As a European experience in the 19th and the first half of the 20th century shows, this is probably yet another manifestation of the sense of being exceptional and refusing to learn from the experiences of others from which so many societies have suffered throughout history. Another historical and political ideology factor specific to China should also be mentioned, however, namely the extraordinary violence of the Maoist period, in particular the Cultural Revolution. If you watch the Steven Pinker book, The Battle of Angels of Our Nature, where he makes the top 22 most violent periods in human history, only two periods are considered like this, and the most violent one was the Maoist China, which was number 11, which have a profound influence on the perception of inequality and particularly of family transmission processes. China has only recently emerged from the major traumatic experience in which the effort to interrupt the intergenerational reproduction inequality took a particularly radical form with the arrest and ostracism of anyone whose family background was linked to any way to the former imperial landlord or intellectual classes. Large segments of Chinese society, including much of today's ruling class, saw grandparents or other relatives killed or hardly treated during the Cultural Revolution. After such a violent repudiation and transmission process for which so many families paid dearly, the logical accumulation has reasserted itself in China, at least for now. In Brothers, 2006, the Chinese novelist Yu Huan described the intersecting destinies of Jew brothers to evoke the radical transformation of values in China from the time of the Cultural Revolution, where the descendants of former landlords were hunted down and chastity was promoted. To the 2000s, where there was nothing that could not be bought or sold, this includes factories and land equally exchanged for cash by greedy local party officials, to fake breasts and hymens used to manufacture contestants for virgin beauty contests for delegates of the new Chinese man, who was eager to profit from everything the world had to offer, and to say nothing of filling the pockets of the contest promoters. Once the economy was opened on and businesses were privatized, the watchword was anything goes, as long as regional GDP statistics continued to soar. Li Guangtuo, called Buddy Li in the English translation, and Song Gan, both born in 1960, are half-brothers. Li is clearly the less honest of the two, and it is he who becomes a billionaire. He starts out in the 1980s in a scrap business by recycling metal and manufacturing cardboards, makes fortune in the 1990s by selling freighter loads of used Japanese suits which replaced the now unfashionable Mao jackets, and in the 2000s becomes a multimillionaire who dresses in Armani and contemplates paying for a ride to the moon on a spaceship. In the end, however, he seemed almost more likable than Song Gan, who allowed himself to be grounded to bits by the evolving system. The Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976, which is hard on both brothers, is portrayed as an attempt to reshape minds while blaming scapegoats for the failure of agriculture and industrial collectivization to yield the anticipated great leap forward in the 1950s and 1960s. Song's father, who is the pride and joy of both boys, with his red armband and enthusiastic communist spirit, is soon arrested, and the family home is searched. As the son of the landlord and himself a teacher, Song's father embodies to a former ruling class, which, whether he knows it or not, is sabotaging the revolution because it's contemptuous of the people, of who it knows nothing. The Red Guards make it their own mission to remind the boy's father that through cultural and ideological transformation, that China would atone for its deeply egalitarian past. For all their ideological zeal, the Red Guard also displayed a flair for practical realities. When they come to search the house, they empty all the closets in search of land deeds, ready to be pulled out should there be any change of regime. They could not find any, but Sun Fanping is lynched anyway. The Chu boy, assisted by Tao Gwing, wheeled his body home through the street of Lin Town in a cart. Beyond the drama of the tale, the book allows the reader to gauge the magnitude of the disturbing political ideological transformation that led within the few decades from the Cultural Revolution to the Chinese hypercapitalism from the socialist made rabbit caramels that delighted the young boys in the late 1960s and early 70s, when only a district commander of the People's Army was entitled to a new bicycle, to the great national gold rush of the 1990s, with its juicy business deals, and ultimately today's China, which newly rich billionaires dream of traveling to the moon. On the Chinese model and transcendence of parliamentary democracy. Note: moreover that the Chinese regime survived by capitalizing on the weakness of other models, having learned from the failures of the Soviet and Mao regimes, the Chinese had no intention of repeating the errors of the Western parliamentary democracy. In this respect, it is highly instructive to read the regimes of the official newspaper The Global Times, especially since Brexit referendum and the election of Donald Trump. One finds lengthy and repeated denunciation of the West's nationalist, xenophobic, and separatist deviations on the explosive cocktail and vulgarity, reality TV, and money is king mentality, which so-called free elections inevitably lead. So much for the marvelous political institution that the West wants to impose on the rest of the world. The paper also emphasized the respect of which Chinese leaders treat other world leaders, especially those of African nations, that the President of the United States, the supposed leader of the free world, has called shithole countries. Reading all this is instructive and raises questions about the supposed civilization and institutional superiority of Western electoral democracy. There is already something absurd about the idea that Western democratic institutions had achieved some sort of unique and unsurpassable perfection. The parliamentary regime, with universal suffrage and elections every 4 or 5 years to choose representatives who then had the power to make law, is a specific, historically determined form of political organization. It has its virtues, but also its limits, which must be constantly questioned and transcended. Among the criticism traditionally leveled at Western institutions by communist regimes, such as the Russian and Chinese, two warrant particular attention. First, equal political rights are illusionary when the news media are captured by the power of money, which gives the wealthy control over mind and political ideology, and thus tend to perpetuate inequality. The second criticism is closely related to the first. Political equality remains purely theoretical. If the way political parties are financed allows the wealthy to influence the political platforms and policies, the fear that the wealthy will capture the political process has been especially potent in the United States since the 1990s, and even more so, the Supreme Court got the American campaign finance laws. The problem is actually much broader in scope, however. Indeed, the implications of how the media and political parties are financed have never really been fully thought through. Immediately, many countries have passed laws that seek to limit media monopolies and regulate political financing, but these laws are often quite inadequate, falling far short of what would be required to ensure equal participation in politics. To say nothing of the many setbacks regulatory effort has suffered in recent decades, especially the United States and Italy, by drawing out the lessons of history. However, one can identify new approaches, including the idea of establishing non-profit and participatory media companies and working toward equality in the financing of political movements. I will come back to these issues in part 4. In any event, the capture of media or political parties by force of money is not the reason to away with the elections or to require a candidate to be approved by the committee on the basis of their compatibility with the party in power. The communist leaders in Russia and Western Europe did use such argument to keep themselves in power by ensuring that there would be no authentic competition in the ballot system. History shows this is wrong. This is the wrong way to oppose the power of money. History also has many examples of regimes that use the power of money over the democratic process as a reason to crack down on the political process. by, for example, transforming the media into propaganda instruments, ostensibly to counter the competing propaganda spread by the private media. In some cases, the results of elections have simply been ignored. Think, for example, the Bolivarian regime in Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, 1998 to 2013, and Nicolas Maduro, 2013 to blank. This regime portrayed itself as a new type of participatory socialism, in the sense that it has used the process from its sale of petroleum in a more egalitarian social manner than previous governments, which is not setting the bar very high given the oligarchic practices of previous regime, but it is still important. While relying on personalities, authoritarians, and hyper-centralized status rule, periodically validated by elections and direct dialogue with the people, think of the famous television program Allo Presidente, in which Chavez spoke directly to the people for better part every Sunday. His record was more than 8 hours. After winning numerous elections and surviving a coup attempt in 2002, which U.S. support the pushscripts, to say nothing of other episodes that will far exceed the scope of this book, the regime was finally defeated unambiguously in 2015 legislative election. It refused to accede to the decision of the voter, however leading to a serious and violent crisis against the background of hyperinflation and economic collapse which countries has of this writing, 2019. Chavez's relation to the media is interesting because there is no doubt that the leading private media in Venezuela, as in most countries in Latin America and throughout the world, had often been biased in favor of the worldview of their owners, as well as the interests of the financial banker mostly linked to hyper-inegalitarian exploitation of petroleum resources in partnership with a major Western firm. Still, to use this state of affairs as a pretext to take control of public media and that reject the result of an election that failed to turn out as hoped is not a satisfactory response. In the end, este, you know, it, shit. Such tactics only reinforce the proprietarian ideology they claim to combat. If the present situation makes clear for hyper-centralized power to ride rough salt over democratic institutions, resolve nothing. A more promising approach is to radically reform the system for financing and governing the media and political parties so that each person has an equal opportunity to express him or herself, one person, one vote, rather than $1, one vote, while respecting the diversity of points of view in the need for alternation. I will come back to this. To all of these legitimate and complex questions, the Chinese regime has one answer, namely that the reliance on solid intermediary bodies such as the CCP, with membership of roughly 90 million in 2015 or 10% of the adult population, makes it possible to organize the process of deliberation and decision making so as to achieve a stable, harmonious, and rational development model that is protected from the totalitarian instinct and centrifugal force rampant in the Western electoral supermarket. This position was forcefully articulated in the 2016 curriculum organized by the Chinese authorities on the role of political parties in the global economic governance. It is regularly discussed on the website of the Global Times, note that the very large membership of the CCP is roughly comparable to the participants in the presidential primaries in the United States and France, about 10% of the total population, in the most recent primaries in both countries. Active membership of Western political parties is much lower, at most a few percent of the population. Participation in legislative presidential election is much higher, however, generally more than 50%, although there has been an alarming decline in recent decades, particularly in the working class population. In every case, the Chinese argument rests on the idea that deliberation and decision-making within the organization, such as the CCP, will be more profound and rational than Western-style democracy in the public square. Instead of relying on a few minutes of the voters' superficial attention every 4 or 5 years, as in the West, China's party-managed democracy is supposed to be guided by a significant minority of the population made up of party members, about 10% of the population, who are fully involved in the informed and who deliberate collectively and in depth for the good of the country as a whole, which is straight up authoritarianism. There is no actual democracy. It's only 10% of the population. Literally, nobody's in. The people have no power. Such a system, is argued, is better equipped to strike reasonable compromise in the interest of the nation and the entire community, particularly when it comes to question of borders and property. Hu Xinxin, the current editor-in-chief of the Global Times, has given an account of his career which illustrates the Chinese belief in the ability of party-managed democracy to deal more effectively with border questions than electoral democracy. As a young student, Hu was deeply involved with the Tiananmen demonstration of 1989. He tells of being traumatized by the sudden dismantling of the Soviet Union and even more by the separatist and tribal wars that tore apart the former Yugoslavia, which brought home to him the need for the party to play a peacemaking role and the possibility of leaving such decisions to voter whimsical passions. Note too that standard and well-honed Chinese criticism of pro-democracy militants in Hong Kong is that they are selfish, especially when they oppose or express doubt about immigration from the People's Republic of China. In other words, the accusation that the Hong Kong Democrats suppose love of democracy and free elections is actually intended to keep the privileges they enjoy in their city-state enclave entirely for themselves. In fact, only a minority within the Hong Kong movement called for independence. The movement's main demand is for democracy in the federal China that allows free circulation of people and political pluralism, a demand that is rejected outhand by the CCP. On the single-party state and reformability of the party-managed democracy. Another key CCP argument is that the party represents all strata of the population, even if only a minority are active members. It is minority more motivated and determined than the average Chinese citizen because party members are actually selected and must prove their continued dedication, as well as more profound representative than Western parties and electoral democracies allow. In fact, according to available data, of the 19 million members of the CCP in 2015, 50% were workers, employees, or peasants. 20% retirees, and 30% administrators or technical managers in state firms. Admittedly, managers are overrepresented. They constitute only 20 or 30% of the population, but the gap is not very wide, and certainly narrower than in most Western countries. These arguments for the superiority of Chinese party-managed democracy are interesting and potentially convincing in strictly theoretical terms, but they nevertheless run into a number of serious difficulties. First, it is quite difficult to know what role workers, employees, and peasants really play in the actual functioning of the party at the local level. At the highest level, the National People's Congress (NPC), which is the primary legislative party of the Chinese Constitution, to an even greater extent the level of the Standing Committee, which wields the real power at the NPC's annual meeting. We find that Chinese billionaires and the world of business in general are dramatically overrepresented. The Western press often harps on these points as evidence of the hypocrisy of the Chinese regime, which is closer to plutocracy than to communism, with deliberately socially representative cells. The critique is on the mark. Note, however, that the available data are far more precise. The wealthy are undeniably overrepresented in the NPC, but perhaps not much more than in the US Congress, which is not particularly reassuring. Still, the overrepresentation of the wealthy seems much greater than we see in Europe, where the disadvantaged classes are severely underrepresented in the parliament, but it's the intellectual profession rather than the businessmen and wealthy who are overrepresented. In any case, there is little support at this stage for the notion that the Chinese-style party-managed democracy is more representative than the Western electoral democracy. Furthermore, as things currently stand, the idea that the liberation within a enlightened minority of party members is somehow more profound poses a major problem. There is no record of these deliberations, so that Chinese citizens, much less anyone outside China, cannot form their own opinion of what was actually discussed or how decisions were taken, and therefore cannot judge the ultimate legitimacy of the party-led deliberative model, which is dictatorship. This is against socialism. Things could be done differently. Debates among party members could be made entirely public, and decisions and candidate selections could be subject to generally open competitive votes. At this point, however, there is no sign that the Beijing regime will evolve in this direction anytime soon. There is an interesting historical example of a single-party system that eventually allowed candidates from other parties and opinion groups. Senegal, for instance, was a one-party system from independence until the constitutional reform of 1976, but eventually authorized select parties of other ideological stripes to present candidates. It was a foregone conclusion that the Socialist Party, the party of President Senghor when Senegal was a one-party state, would win the first pseudo-free election of the 1980s, but playing the field was gradually leveled and eventually Abdoulaye Wade's Senegal's Democratic Party won in 2000. Without idealizing the Senegalese case, it does show that political transition can follow many pathways. To sum, on, to sum up, China's party meritocracy is yet to demonstrate its superiority over Western electoral democracy, owing in part to the flagrant lack of transparency, the very sharp increase of inequality in China, and the extreme opacity of Chinese data also raise serious doubt about the degrees to which the lower classes are actually involved in the supposedly representative deliberative process that the CCP claims to embody. Nevertheless, China's many criticisms of Western political system should be taken seriously. The power of money over the media and parties or the structural difficulty of dealing with the problems of borders and property rights are important issues, as the fact that parliamentary institutions are increasingly dominated by close circles of insiders in both the European Union and the United States, whereas more traditional representative mechanisms need to be complemented by agreements allowing for true deliberation and participation rather than just casting a ballot every 4 or 5 years. There's always need to reinvent democracy in its concrete form. And to that end, it's useful to compare different models and historical experiences, assuming the comparison can be concluded without prejudice or nationalist arrogance.